Can I pause here?
Yeah.
Leptin is produced where?
Yeah, leptin is produced. Yeah, let's talk about leptin a little bit. It's produced in fat cells, and it's produced in proportion to the size of fat tissue. So the amount of body fat you have, the more fat you have, the more leptin you have in the circulation. And basically what this is, it's what's called a negative feedback loop, which is a really simple engineering term that works like a thermostat. So with your thermostat, if you set your thermostat to 70, if it starts getting a little bit hotter, your AC turns on to bring it back down. If it starts getting lower, AC comes on, or the heat comes on to bring it up. That's called the negative feedback system, and it maintains the stability of the temperature of your house. We have many negative feedback loops in the human body to regulate body temperature, to regulate blood pressure, to regulate all sorts of things. One of the negative feedback loops we have regulates body fatness. And the hormone, so your thermostat measures temperature by using a thermostat, a thermometer. Your brain measures body fatness using this hormone leptin that's in the circulation. And then particularly when your body fat level drops, your leptin levels drop, and your brain hears that, and it kicks in a starvation response, basically. And this is the main reason why weight loss is so difficult, because your brain is like, no, I don't want to be losing fat, and it makes you hungrier. It increases your cravings.
Can I pause there?
Yeah,
is that at a certain level of body fat? Is this is this just when you're losing body fat in general? Like even if you're a large person that's overweight,
correct.
When you're losing body fat in general, your body exacerbates your hunger.
And this is the thing that's really important to understand about obesity, is that people with obesity have a higher set point. So it's like turning your thermostat from 70 to 80, and then your thermostat's regulating around 80. People with obesity, they're not regulating around 170 anymore. They're regulating around 250. And so when you cause a lean person to lose weight, you see the same thing as when you cause a person with obesity to lose weight. You see this reaction in their brain circuits that regulate body fatness that drives them to increase their cravings and their hunger. Their metabolic rate drops.
So it would be an evolutionary mechanism to force you to seek food.
Correct. And not just to force you to seek food, that's the main thing, but it also slows your metabolic rate. Does everything it can to get more energy in your body and have less leaving. And it keeps doing that until the fat comes back. Can
I pause here?
Yeah.
So when you're eating a sugary diet, a high calorie diet, you will produce more fat. Your body will get fatter, right? Is this correct?
It depends on how many calories you're eating.
Okay. If you're overeating, you're consuming a lot of sugar, a lot of carbohydrates, your body will get fatter.
Correct.
So your body will produce more leptin.
Correct.
So it comes from the diet.
Yeah, indirectly, definitely.
Can I pause?
Please.
So the leptin is produced not just in response to the size of the fat cell, but in response actually to glucose mediated uptake into the fat cell, which is mediated in part by insulin. So you come back to insulin even with the leptin. You raise blood sugar, and that's the carbs. You eat the carbs, you raise blood sugar, you raise insulin, you raise fat storage, the glucose, and then you get more leptin. Again, one of the things you have to understand about this is everything that's said has two interpretations depending on which paradigm you're looking at, and these are fundamentally different paradigms. So in Stephan's world, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the leptin is signaling fuel availability in the fat cells the way I would think of it, and in my very small world, leptin is responding to fuel availability in the rest of the cells. So it's basically a molecule that can tell other cells that there's fat available, and you could burn that fat for fuel, and then you don't have to go eat. Or it can tell that there isn't fuel available. And if, depending on how much leptin there is, the cells, and then that will respond by a signal to eat or not, to disinhibit eating behavior. Everything we're talking about, Stephan and I first sort of fell out, 8 years ago at Ancestral Health Symposium when I acted inappropriately. But one of the problems I had, so the way I think you should think about this, you have a hypothesis, and this is the fundamental thing, is obesity caused by overeating? Because we know if you're getting fatter, you're storing more calories than you expend. That's just that's like if a room is getting more crowded, more people are entering than leaving. That is the simplest, but it doesn't tell you why the room's getting crowded. It doesn't tell you why you're getting fatter. And again, what I've been arguing is the why you're getting fatter part has been left out, and people decided that overeating was somehow an explanation. And then they went to the brain to look at why people might overeat. So one of the questions I asked Stephan 8 years ago, and it keeps coming up, is if we're going to blame obesity on the modern food environment, epidemics of obesity, simple question to ask is, can we find epidemics of obesity without this modern food environment? I mean, that's a sort of science 101, right? Mm-hmm. And it turns out that the world is full. And the first one I found in the literature was in 1902 in a population of the Pima, Native American tribe, the Pima, living in Arizona. And observers saying these people are poor, they're malnourished, they're suffering through famines. They've been suffering through a famine for 40 years. And famines, it's hard to overeat during a famine. And yet the women of the tribe, who do virtually all the work, they were treated as pack animals in effect, were obese. So now we can disassociate obesity from the modern food environment, and we could disassociate it from this ultra-processed foods we eat and start to ask the question, what is it about? Can we find what might have driven obesity in that population, despite the existence of famine? So it's from very simple observation. Once we get into these kind of studies, say this, and human genome studies say that, I actually rarely do that in my books because you can find studies that will say anything. And you'll see in the studies people misinterpreting them.
What was the cause of the population of women to be obese?
Well, so one thing that happened during the beginning in the 1860s, the Pima were put on a reservation. Well, they moved on to a reservation. They were reservationized, whatever the verb form would be. And they began eating Western foods. And back then it was sugar, flour, and lard for the most part, and sugary beverages probably. So that's a reasonable hypothesis. And you could find the same thing in the Sioux, Native American Sioux population living on a reservation in 1928, where you had both obese men and women living with malnourished, stunted children who clearly weren't getting enough diet, but they were on a reservation, they were getting Western foods. So ultimately, the question you ask in science determines the answer you get. So the question I was asking is, we have this observation that any population that transitions to a Western diet or a Western diet and lifestyle gets obese and diabetic. They develop what's called metabolic syndrome, which is insulin resistance and all these issues. And we know that's true all over the world, from the Inuit to the Pima to South Pacific Islanders to Africans to Europeans. So the genetics aren't that important. The question is what's triggering it in the environment. And again, Stephan would say, well, there's too much food available and it's too palatable and we can't say no. And I have a lot of problems with the we can't say no part, because if we're lean, it means they can't say no, and they being the people with obesity, and I don't believe that's true. And then, or is it some specific item or some specific group in these foods that travel with Western populations? And so the ability, and today if you look up dual burden of obesity and malnutrition, I have a Dropbox folder I could share with you. There's probably 50 studies all over the world. You see the same observation: incredibly poor populations, malnourished. The children are stunted, which means they're protein deficient and they're calorie deficient. And often the mothers or the aunts are obese. The obesity tends to run in the females, which suggests it has a female sex hormone related effect that I don't believe works in the brain, because we're dealing with populations that could not have overeaten. If they could have overeaten, why are the kids starving? That's sort of the question. And this was the first thing that I think we thought about back then, and it's still, if you can find populations with obesity epidemics, but without the modern food system, without snack wells and without Lay's potato chips, and if you know that they're going through a famine, or you know that the kids at least aren't getting enough food, how do you explain obesity in the mothers without assuming that the mothers are overeating?
Let's pause right there. Stephan, is there a population of people that are obese, that are not eating a Western diet, that are not eating sugary foods?
That are obese and that are not eating sugary foods? Probably not, because generally once you have an industrialized food system, that's going to include sugar. But there are populations that eat a lot of sugar and are not obese. And we should talk about some of these. Actually, let's talk about the Pima
Can you
first.
go back to the...
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about the Pima first. Now, Gary has told a story. He's told his version of the Pima story. Let me tell the version of the story that appears in the scientific literature. Now, the Pima, originally, they were agriculturalists. They were eating traditionally a very high carbohydrate diet based on unrefined carbohydrates. Originally, it was corn, beans, and squash primarily.
They were hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists.
They were primarily...
hunters.
Gary, okay. They were primarily eating agricultural foods. They were also collecting some wild foods, that's correct. They were fishing and eating mesquite pods, primarily agricultural. And data are very clear on that, Gary. So
No.
yes, they are. Look, we have data.
We can't say things like that, Stephan, because we're going to disagree on what the data say.
Let's move on. You think they ate mostly fish. That's incorrect, okay, according to the data. I remember you saying that in your book, something to that effect.
Stephan, read what you've got in my book. Read what I say.
Anyway,
just read what I say.
Let's go on.
We don't have to argue about it. Read what I say.
I'm going to move on here. Now, the Pima traditionally were agriculturalists, and what happened basically is you had all these farmers moving into their area, settlers of European descent, and they diverted the water from their river, the Gila or Gila River, I forget how you pronounce Gila. And so they were no longer able to grow their crops, their agricultural crops that they were primarily dependent on, and therefore the government started providing them with foods to eat. And these were calorie-dense refined foods. They were, like Gary said, flour, lard, and sugar. And then they became very obese. Now, there was a population of Pima right across the border from them in Mexico, also very similar culturally and all that maintained their traditional high carbohydrate lifestyle and agricultural lifestyle. And there have been studies comparing those two populations. And the ones across the border with their traditional lifestyle are a lot leaner and healthier, not surprisingly, than the ones eating lard, flour, and sugar, okay? But Gary, you seem to believe that people can gain weight. You kept referring to famines and things. You seem to believe that people can gain weight even if they are eating very few calories. And you refer to this many times in your writing. And, you know, these are very casual observations that you're making, kind of these casual correlations and storytelling. But if you actually look at the data on this, what you see is that if you just measure calorie intake in people who have obesity, it is 20 to 35% higher than people who are lean after correcting for height, physical activity level. And that I've got the references there.
No. Just, it's okay.
This is we're getting a little bit into the weeds here.
Let me give you an example.
Reference number 7.
Can I pause you guys right here? Yeah. So these people, they have essentially the same lineage. One group lives in Mexico. They're not eating these sugary foods in this Western diet. The ones that live in America are. The ones that live in America are becoming obese. The ones that live in Mexico are not. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. And so now if you have someone with obesity, like I've said, the most accurate measures that we have suggest that they habitually consume and expend more calories. And now, Gary's model says that is downstream of the fattening effect. It's not causing the fattening effect. It is a result of the fattening effect, whereas my model says that is actually required for the fattening effect to occur. It is upstream.
So
now, what happens, Gary?
Fat?
What happens if you reduce their calorie intake by that same amount, 20 to 35%? It doesn't matter if you do it by restricting carbs or fat. These experiments have been done. They lose weight when you restrict their calorie intake down to that of a lean person. So this is the
argument, what you're saying, that you consuming low amounts of calories but high amounts of sugar doesn't make sense. You can get obese that way. So you're saying it's a calorie
correct.
dependent.
And that's reference number 9 and 10 to support what I just said. And I want to talk about another one that
Wait, can we hold on, Stephan?
let's
But
keep
the
going.
reason I was using the dual burden example is because we have to explain how those women were eating all those calories. Usually women, again. It's just often these studies were done by diabetes researchers who were studying diabetes in these populations, and the men had high levels of diabetes and the women had high levels of obesity. To give you an example where that measurement was done, in Trinidad in the 1960s, and again, all I'm doing, this is the role I played, is I asked the question, can you find populations that don't have a lot of food? Okay, you could say that the obese expend a lot of energy and they eat a lot of calories. The question is, can they get obese without a lot of food? And so can we find populations? Like you asked, can you find a population that gets obese without sugar? Which was exactly the question to ask. So in Trinidad in the 1960s, there's a malnutrition crisis. The U.S. government sends a team of researchers down to study this. And the researchers come back and say, yeah, there's malnutrition, there's stunting, there's deficiency diseases, and 2/3 of the adult women are obese. And this is a medical problem. And the next year, an MIT nutritionist goes down to do exactly what Stephan asks for and to actually measure the diets in obese women and lean women and to study it. And this is a population where it's not like, this is a very poor Trinidadian population. And reports that I think it was 1,800 calories a day, what the obese women were eating was actually a little less than what the lean people seemed to be eating, and that it was lower than what the Food and Agriculture Organization considered for a healthy diet. So again, what my role in this is to point out when you have populations like that, I don't see how the overeating hypothesis tells me the brain is in control of how much they eat, tells me anything about why the women were obese, especially when their kids are starving. This is the paradox of this dual burden, an obese mother with a starving child. If the obese mother has to eat superfluous calories to get fat, why isn't she giving those calories to her kids? Because she doesn't need them. She clearly doesn't need them. She's got fuel. So what's going on there? If you posit a hypothesis, as I did, which says that the obesity is triggered by the macronutrient content of the diet, then you can explain. There are plenty of animal models. A famous quote I use in my books from Jean Mayer, it was like the leading Harvard nutritionist who studied an obese strain of animals in the 50s. He said, my animals will get fat even when half starved. They will make fat out of their food even when half starved.
These are generally animals with mutations in the leptin
it doesn't, whatever
pathway,
gene
by
it
the way.
is. Whatever gene it is,
Well,
kind of, the question is if, I can make fat out of my food at levels at caloric levels that, for instance, a lean person can't, then I'm going to get fat eating the same amount. And that fat accumulation is going to be, means I'm taking in more calories than I expend. But the point is for some metabolic hormonal reason, I'm taking the fuel I eat and turning it into fat and storing it in the fat tissue.
What is your response to this?
Yeah, so my response is that if you want the best answers, you have to use the best methods to answer the questions, okay? If you want a question answered properly, you have to use accurate methods to answer that question. Now, as you know, Gary, it's very difficult to measure food intake in free-living individuals, particularly you're traveling to a country you've never been to before. It's very difficult to get accurate measures. So just because some guy went to Trinidad and claimed...
It was a woman, actually.
Okay, fine. Just because some woman went to Trinidad and claimed that people were eating 1,800 calories and becoming obese does not mean that that's what actually happened. Now, No, Gary, I'm responding. Now, we have studies where researchers used accurate measures to measure calorie intake in people who had obesity. Many of these people were saying we're only eating 1,200 calories a day. When they actually measured their calorie intake, what they found was that they were consistently eating more calories than lean people. So this phenomenon that Gary describes is something that is only observed when inferior methods are used to measure calorie intake.
Wait, Stephan, the reason I'm using these populations, like I said, I'm just giving you an observation. Obese mother with a starving child, the dual burden of malnutrition and obesity. This isn't one observation. It's not one nutritionist. The existence of the starving children strongly suggests that there's not a lot of food available. And we have to explain obesity in the mother. That's what I would like you to respond to.
Okay, fine. I will respond to that. Now, look, I haven't looked at these studies in particular.
I brought them up 8 years ago. We got in a fight about it. We
Wonderful.
fell out 8
Okay.
years ago. It ruined our, it's like we used to be buddies.
So now, look, there are many reasons why a child could be malnourished in a non-industrial situation. And I do a lot of work related to this. What you see in non-industrial situations, you see a lot of infectious disease, you see a lot of malnutrition, so people not getting enough essential minerals and vitamins, not getting enough protein, and you see a lot of children who are just barely hanging on because of this collection of really bad stuff that's happening in their lives. And so
parasites, things along those lines.
Yeah, parasites, malaria. I don't know if there's malaria in Trinidad or not, but I mean, all the diarrhea, pneumonia, these are the things that we all had before we had modern medicine and great sanitation in a country like the United States. 30% of kids didn't even make it past childhood. And so there's a lot of things that could have caused that, Gary. It's not necessarily because, it's not necessarily the reason that you attribute it to. Now,
I'm not attributing it to a reason. I'm just asking for explanations.
Well, great. Well, I don't have the explanation, but I'm throwing out possibilities that are alternative to the one that you're implying.
And that's quite possible, too.
Okay. So now, so again, when you use accurate measures of calorie intake, you find that these people with magical metabolisms who have obesity and don't eat very much seem to not exist anymore. And furthermore, I want to get to another type of study that's really going to differentiate between this metabolic effect driven by insulin and the effect of calories. So we have a lot of studies that compared diets in which calories were the same, but carbohydrate and fat intake differed. And the ones that I really want to focus on right now that I think are key here are the studies where they increased calorie intake. So they fed people, one study in particular, and let's see, I'm going to give you a number here. Let me see if I can give you a number here, sorry.
While you look at that, can we bring up another issue? Because what we're talking about ultimately is why people get fat.
Okay, I don't want to divert here. I'm in the middle of something. So now, if we want to understand why people get fat, we can look at studies that overfed people on fat or carbohydrate exclusively. So this one study, the first one that I want to talk about, first they figured out people's baseline calorie intake, figured out how many calories they needed just to maintain, and then they increased that by 50% by exclusively giving them fat or exclusively giving them carbohydrate. Okay.
Which study was this?
This is Horton.
Okay. Give me a second.
Yeah, so
when
number
you're done.
16. Number 16. So now, if Gary's hypothesis is correct, these people should have gained body fat on the carbohydrate overfeeding, but not the fat overfeeding, because that increases your insulin and has these effects on your fat cells, et cetera. Okay. Now, these were very rigorous studies. I want to emphasize that.
Can I pause here? Did they monitor the actual calories they got?
Correct. Yeah. So they were. Go ahead.
They had a baseline.
They used prisoners in the
they-
Vermont State Prison.
No, that's incorrect.
But
This
hold on
is
a
a
sec.
different study.
So they had a baseline, and did they require them to maintain the same diet and then add additional fat or additional carbohydrates?
Yes.
Yes.
So
they
same
exact
diet,
same foods.
and then they just bump it up with fat or bump it up with carbohydrate.
Which study did Horton do? It wasn't Sims. It was Ethan Sims. But which
Talking
study
to the
did he
mic,
do that
please.
was? Which study did he do that was not prisoners? What was the? He didn't have a metabolic.
You know
ward.
what? Let me just finish describing this study.
No, it's just
Gary, that's an irrelevant detail. Okay.
What's relevant is that you just implied that I don't know what I'm talking about.
Gary, you know what? I don't actually know. Maybe it was in prisoners. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. Now, but it was not the Sims overfeeding study that was done in prisoners. That's what I know. Okay.
Okay.
So-
Reference. What's the reference?
Yeah, it's on my website. You can go to my website, StephanGuyenet.com, and it's reference number 16, and they're both there. Okay. So this was what's called a metabolic ward study, where these people were in a research facility where the researchers could monitor and control every morsel of food. So there was no cheating, no inaccuracy, and they were measuring changes in body fatness using a gold standard method called underwater weighing, okay? And so what they found was that at the end of a 2-week period of overfeeding, the carb and the fat groups gained the exact same amount of body fat, exact same amount of body fat. There was another second study that did the same thing and found the same result. Independent lab group, very similar experiment, 3-week long instead of 2 weeks. They found the exact same thing, same amount of fat gain, different insulin responses, different amounts of carbohydrate and fat, exact same amount of fat gain. So this demonstrates that insulin is not, and carbs are not what controls what gets fat into fat tissue. Calorie intake is what controls that.
So let me explain again. Remember, I talked about everything. The paradigm you work in determines the question you ask. And this experiment is a classic example because they assume that people get fat by overfeeding. So then they say, if we overfeed them, we're just doing what happens naturally. Everything about the experiment is based on the assumption that they're supposed to be testing, which is, can people get fat by overfeeding? And so from the very conception of the experiment, they've built in the paradigm that we want to test, the hypothesis. On top of it, if it's a typical Sims experiment, I actually wasn't familiar with this one. It wasn't Sims, it was James Hill and J.C. Peters. James Hill was funded for from about 1998 to about 2008 by Procter & Gamble because he was an Olestra shill. I hate to say that, Jim. I apologize, but I think it's a fair assessment. And then when he stopped being funded by Procter & Gamble, he was funded by the sugar industry. And J.C. Peters was the head of the Procter & Gamble Olestra.
Olestra, which is now something that no one eats.
Yeah, Olestra was a fat substitute. And the problem was you got like run out of the
diarrhea
gas and shit like that. But the whole idea of Olestra was to replace fat in the diet. So every study Hill and Peters did implicated dietary fat as a cause of obesity. I don't think we could ever use, I hate to say it, I don't think funding influences results, but I wouldn't use a James Hill study to make that point.
Because you think it's a biased study that was influenced
everything Hill and Peters did. And when it was, I talked about this in Good Calories, Bad Calories. When they reported their results, I did a FOIA on James Hill because he works for the University of Colorado. So you could I got all his documents back and forth between him and Olestra. I'd be happy to share them with you if you'd like. They're relevant. Him and Procter & Gamble, but he basically held Procter & Gamble for ransom. He would get a $500,000 unrestricted gift, and then he would do a study, and then he would ask it, and it would conclude that fat is bad and carbs are good, and therefore Olestra is a viable product. Then he would ask for Procter & Gamble for more money before he then published the study. So it's a particularly egregious example of someone who's, I suspect it was just his belief system. He believed dietary fat was bad, fat caused obesity. Olestra is a good thing because you eat that instead of fat, you don't absorb it. And then every study he did confirmed that.